No, until it either breaks down or runs out of ink, which is, so to speak, outside the terms of reference. Now, what I want to give you the idea of is that difference between oscillation and total contradiction is represented in these cases I've been giving you of the thermostat, the COPS, the other thing. What was the other thing? What did we find? The skeet shooting, yes. No. The tribe, yes, that's right. The oscillation between classification and process. The naming of classification and the naming of process. You see, you don't, in the world of real events, jump from the item to the class of classes, to the class of classes, the way you would in a Russellian system. It's a double jump each time. And you've got this zigzag. It's an oscillatory system. And you see, we now have the beginnings of a way of abducting onto this from the cases that I've given you, and a way of building an explanation of a great deal of really very quite complex social phenomena. Okay, that's enough. I'm sorry to inflict some rather difficult stuff on you in patches, but I hope I've made it clear. Questions? Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
What was that? The last statement you made about that difference between oscillation and total contradiction is the same thing as it was going on in all the classes of objects before? I didn't quite catch that.
The thing is, how are you going to represent in, let us say, words, since it's the stuff we're using here, what happens to the paradox of the liar when, in fact, you see, you're talking about causation, the if-then of cause, and not the if-then of logic. You get oscillation. And really, if you want to spell out the oscillation, what you have is state 1, swing, state 2, swing, state 1, swing, state 2, swing. And you've got that swing, you see, between. And that's the sort of middle term in George Spencer Brown's sort of double bracket stuff and so on. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but I would just mention that as on the side here for those that play with those games, right? Get a mic.
As you were speaking about typologies, you characterize them as villainous and as the source of things.
Dangerous.
Dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, a dangerous step in one's reasoning.
Yeah.
And as a phenomenon with nasty after effects. But I wonder if you don't think there's something inherently unreasonable about that stage in particular in the first place. Is there an inherent illogic to the mapping of a typology against a set of phenomena that you don't really understand in the first place?
Yeah, we're on quite difficult ground, aren't we?
Well,
Got fun. You see, I drew you yesterday what I called a hexarectagon, yes? And I pointed out to you that in describing the hexarectagon, you necessarily are embarking upon an artificial dissection of the animal in order to describe it, right? Right, now we've done the same thing, you see, now. In a much more complicated way. But all the objections that could be raised against assigning parts to the hexarectagon apply to assigning typology to a bunch of people. Oh, Kretschmer's system is dreadful. Sure, they were quite prepared to put them all in lunatic asylums for being the other type. Obviously, the other type always belongs in lunatic asylums anyway, you see. Does that answer your question? Not quite.
the answer to my question is...
Can you answer it?
Yes, there is something inherently illogical. Is that not? That sounds not.
There is an illogicalness in chopping off at the point of typology.
Well then, another question. What is the use of typologies in the first place?
It's a way station to ask yourself a problem about process.
Excuse me, Gregory.
Yeah?
When they're transcribing this later, it's going to make no sense to people having you just give answers to questions that aren't there. So, could use the microphone, please.
What is happening? Oh, you haven't got a mic anymore. I'm sorry.
Hang it over.
Good.
Well, I'm done talking.
Yep.
I speculate that the solution may be to see measurement as a process that involves the observer, such that first we classify, then we must do something to take into account the fact that we bring something to the situation in terms of which we produce the classification.
Correct.
We then classify that, but we then must go the next step and say when we classify that, we're still bringing something probably different because we've learned from that.
Yeah.
So we have to see our measurement as never purely external, objective, and absolute. It always has to be that measurement is a process that involves the measurer.
We supply the tautology, after all. It isn't there.
Right.
This front one.
Is your discussion implying a criticism of explanation that follows a linear causal form?
It does in fact criticize that, yes.
Okay.
And the oscillatory system, in fact, is the top of the iceberg, so to speak, of a non-linear system, which is a servo circuit, which oscillates because it has circuit structure and can oscillate because it has circuit structure. Yes, that's correct.
Would you say...
Should I be spelled out some more for the company? Maybe.
Yeah, would you? I would appreciate that.
Yeah. We have a bunch of somethings, doesn't matter how many, and they are so rigged as to affect each other You can think of these either as variables or as parts of a machine or something. This might be a fuel supply. This might be what happens in a cylinder. This might be a governor. And the governor is going to work on a faucet which controls the fuel supply, yes? A tap. Now, this is your source of energy, do you see? Internal to the system. And we will rig it in such a way that the more of this, the more of that, the more of this, the more of that, the more of this, the more of that, and now the thing will go whoosh, because the faster it goes, the more fuel it gets, and it won't self-correct. Let's rig it so that the more of this, the less of this, the more the arms of the governor fly out, the less fuel is let through this faucet. And now we have a chance. The thing might self-correct. But now it self-corrects by virtue of, quote, error. That is, if that's the right place for the arms of the governor, with the weights on the end, you know, and it falls down to there, this will add fuel and bring it up again, but it'll overshoot. It will, at least theoretically, always overshoot, and can never really make a true straight line, a true steady state, a true flat steady state. It therefore is going to oscillate. Or if you want to do it with a digital system with an on-off switch, like a thermostat, the thermostat will of course always oscillate, you see. On, off. Between, what, 65 and 68 we had it going. Now that oscillation, what was the form of the question that you was answering?
Well, I was just saying that you were implying that many phenomenon could not be explained through a linear
system. Yeah, this is the non-linear phrasing of it, and the oscillation is the spin-off from the fact it is a circular system.
Wouldn't you also say that perhaps the fact that we are taught in school not abduction but induction and deduction gives us a prejudice towards linear explanations?
Sure does.
Yes.
Practically everything you're taught in school does. Yep.
When we're talking about the two kinds of system, complementary and symmetrical, is there any kind of value judgment which you deduce from that? Like, what I mean is one better than the other? Is one more conducive?
No. Either alone is disastrous.
So is the balance of the two some kind of model for a sane society or a sane relationship?
At least in the case of this New Guinea society that I was talking about, yes.
I'm thinking about the article I read on alcoholism. Alcoholism, in which there's a symmetrical relationship between the boozer and the bottle. And when some kind of complementary aspect can be introduced, then there's some hope of recovery. I was wondering whether that was saying that whether symmetrical is better than whether complementary is better than symmetrical, or it's just a combination of the two are needed.
What you have commonly, I won't say this is 100% of all alcoholics, because there are numbers of ways of being an alcoholic. The sort of classical and one of the commonest cases is that in which an alcoholic has a symmetrical psychology between himself and his drinking, and he is going to master his drinking, right? They're not good. And this is in some degree remedied by getting him to realize that his drink can always master him. By accepting a complementary, the passive end of a complementary relationship vis-a-vis the drink. He surrenders to the drink. With that surrender, Alcoholics Anonymous will put upon him the corollary: there's something in the world stronger than you, yeah? The something in the world which is stronger than you has two aspects. One is the bottle, and the other is God. And from there you go on. I once knew a man who had a symmetrical relationship with God. The arrangement was that if he made any error away from perfection, God would have a right to punish him. And if God made any error away from perfection, he would have a right to punish God. There are a few of these people around. They are very dangerous. They are the Raskolnikovs, the people who have to commit a crime to show their freedom. This man in particular was an army warrant officer, professional soldier. He'd had a completely successful, if somewhat bureaucratic, military career. Finally discharged from the army with an honorable discharge, went to one of the state parks in Merced, made an acquaintance with the family parked in the next campground next door to him, who had a 5-year-old daughter, took the daughter for a walk, raped her, murdered her, put her under a bush to show that he was free. From there, it took him quite a long time to get to death row. He got to death row, he had a month there and was finally commuted. But it's not funny to run a competitive relationship with God. He was, of course, as mad as a hatter inside. He was in the high-security mental hospital in California where I met him. He was obviously the most distinguished patient there. Beautiful, great, big, tall, blonde character. Organizing classes for patient therapists in patient-run therapy groups. And inside, absolutely insane. Yeah.
Your friend was mad as a hatter inside. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between inside and outside?
Well, I mean, he was a very religious man, you know. All this stuff with God. I got that thick of single-spaced letters from him in jail discussing his relationships with God. He was actually condemned by the men of the small town where the park was. They don't like this happening to their daughters. The thing which condemned him was that he had tried to hide the body under a bush. He thereby showed that he knew the difference between right and wrong. That was the turning point of the trial. This is something to do with the inside-outside problem, yeah. He never told anybody except me. Yeah, he did tell some of it to the chaplain, and the chaplain didn't listen. This business with God. He wrote it all out. They picked him up about 3 days after the crime, no difficulty. And he was then completely psychotic, babbling all sorts of nonsense. And when he appeared before the judge said, "I cannot try a man who cannot speak in his own defense," which is, I suppose, national, certainly California law. And these people then get sent to a mental hospital to be made sane enough to be tried. Some of them break down and go psychotic during trial, and then they get sent to the hospital to be made sane enough to be executed. It's a very peculiar society we live in. It really is. All right. I'd had a couple of conversations with him about patient organization. I had not gone into his case at all with him, his story. But after he was shifted, he became sane, he became this leading patient. And he then insisted on a trial, which we all assumed was practically a suicidal act. However, he had a right to insist on a trial. So they came and took him away in handcuffs, had him tried. And it was while he was sort of waiting trial that he wrote to me initially, and this correspondence developed. The outside and the inside. And the outside was very highly polished, very well organized, knowing very well what not to say, and then deciding in these letters to say it. One usually knows in psychosis, you know, what not to say. They removed a rib out of me at one stage. They wanted to anchor a hiatus hernia. They had me in the operating theater and operated. I woke up on the intensive treatment ward, and they said, "Now, you'd better cough." Now, you know, if you just had a rib taken out and they threw it away and sewed it up more or less, don't cough. That's obvious sense. They said, well, if you don't cough, you know, you'll flood your lungs, and either you'll die or we'll have to pump you out, and it's going to be very unpleasant either way. A neat double bind, well constructed. So I coughed some, and 2 cats came, big grey cats, and they were walking around the floor of the ward. They were quite hairless. I'd never at that time seen a hairless cat, but there are hairless cats. I've seen them since. They were just like hairless cats. They were hairless, sort of grey, leathery objects. And every now and then they'd make a sudden sort of contraction. They were very handy on the whole. They, you know, they were a projection of pain, and when things hurt, they took the hurt, so to speak. And well, finally they came, and they did in fact pump me out at 2 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of the night. And after I'd been pumped out, I became a good deal better and started to get well. They put me on an ordinary ward. I had a telephone, so I started to phone my friends. Yes, I made a note to myself, I remember, that the whole point of all these doctors and nurses was to prevent the suburbs from knowing about the big cats. I was quite intelligent about this. And it was like the fireman, the fire department, which prevents the suburb from knowing about property destruction. And these doctors were to prevent the suburbs from knowing about the cats. As indeed they are, The cats are my pain, and that's what doctors are for, to prevent the suburbs from knowing about my pain and their own pain. So I'm back with the telephone, and I ring up my friends, and I say, well, here I am back in the suburbs. Didn't tell them about the cats, though. And you sort of know, that you shouldn't exhibit your psychosis. Not in the wrong context. Yeah.
The friend you were talking about seems to have striking similarities in many cases to this guy that was recently caught in New York, Son of Sam. And I wondered if you might have anything to say about
I haven't read the Sam case. I don't know what it sounds like. I saw they'd caught a man they thought was Sam, Son of Sam. But it's the same sort of story, yes.
Similar things in many cases, because as bananas as he appears to be, there also seems to be somewhat of a torqued kind of religious streak going through him, in the sense that he's been saying that he's received orders from a dog, and the voice is 6,000 years old, which is a kind of interesting slant.
Oh yeah, it's all quite well worked out, yes.
He's got some ancestors.
Yeah, I'll have a look. Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak to this question. I speculate from what you've said about measurement and the presence of the observer in this process. And I thought about the question that was asked about what implications for society. I wonder if you could speak to the question of hierarchic organization of society versus anarchic, and by that I mean primarily local control organization of society, in terms of achieving optimum oscillation.
Really without data, but having had a good deal of conversation with Paul Goodman, who was a theoretical anarchist, and an anarchist in the same sense of favoring small is beautiful, decentralization, and all of that. The trouble is that we have this enormously elaborate technology, and if, for example, you're going to have a hospital, you're going to have in that hospital several $1 million worth of machinery. This, in terms of our economic premises, defines how big a community that hospital is going to have to serve in order to maintain its economic balance. And that unit is often quite big. However, yes, and I don't know really whether it worked, we did have a conference in New York with planners from Mayor Lindsay's office. They were doing a replan of Midtown New York, about 40 blocks long, in the middle of 40, street blocks long. The central point in that whole replanning that we did at that stage was to try to centralize everything down that we could centralize down. And I believe we did do a little bit of it, and a little bit even got through into bylaws or building laws and things. But yes, makes a great deal of sense to me. The difficulty in New York the principal planner we were dealing with, Jacqueline Robertson, had in his plan to make Madison Avenue into a mall. He got it through all the interested bodies except the organization of taximen. He somehow missed the organization of taximen in the early phase of the planning, and when it hit the taximen, it hit them almost as a fait accompli, as though everybody was against them, you see. Bingo, end of that plan. The more effective way to do it is the way, what's his name, the mayor that really laid down New York City. What? Moses, yes. The way Moses did it. Moses kept his plans in a locked safe and never told anybody. You can't do that anymore.
I'm still trying to get a little better idea of your type of explanation that you presented and discussed here.
Back to the man shaving, yes?
Okay.
Right.
And the mapping that you've mentioned.
Yep.
Could you discuss briefly the difference between the kind of explanation you've talked about and the explanation, what is usually called analogy?
Called?
Analogy.
Yeah.
Why? How is that different from what you've said here?
Analogy, what you do, I offered you really some admixture of analogy in the second half of the talk. That is, I suggested that there was analogy between the ladder of alternating calibration feedback and the ladder of alternating typology process typology. That was analogy, because I really didn't, you see, spell out that piece of abduction at all fully. To have spelled it out fully, I might have sort of got it into the fold of my type of explanation. But it did hang out as analogy, in fact. The sad things about analogy, and by the way, this matter of measurement should be looked at. There is in computer jargon a distinction between digital systems and analogic systems. This is quite a different use of the word analogy from the one you want, really, but it is somehow related. And a digital system of computers is well, I drew that diagram and handled it first as a machine with a governor in which a quantity, a size of this angle of the governor's arms is used as the controlling variable, which then controls another quantity, the fuel supply. Now, if instead of that those become switches, as it does in the house thermostat, you see. It switches on and off. With the switches, that's called digital. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, no, ding dong. And if it goes by quantities, that's called analogic. If the quantities run in step with the quantities you're representing. Now, the other thing that is mixed up with quantity and analog number is the fact that numbers, in the way we play with them, have a characteristic that you can get them right. You arrive at them by counting. How many beans in the bag? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yes? Quantities you can never get right because you arrive at quantities by measurement. You cannot have a gallon of water. You can only have a gallon plus or minus an error. And no amount of fuss with verniers, with devices, with this and that, will ever give you a totally accurate quantity. Numbers you can have totally accurate because they go click, 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 you know. There is a threshold jump between them, which means that they have a different sort of reality altogether. Now, statisticians, you see, are people who handle numbers as though they were quantities. And more or less, most of you have probably been halfway trained to think that numbers are quantities. Well, a lot of them are. The interesting thing is that this sort of difference which I've offered you just now, which looks as though it was a sort of a characteristic of human thought and human laboratory behavior or something, turns out to be very deeply biological epistemology. Actually, there are three things that are meant by numbers. There's numbers by counting, there's numbers by pattern, and numbers as quantity. The numbers as quantity is a sort of bastard hybrid. But if, for example, you look at a rose, a wild rose, a single one, you will see 5 petals, and that 5 is a definite pattern, is as definitely 5 as the 5 points on the 5 of clubs. You know? It's very stable. You don't get 6 very often, you don't get 4 very often, or if so, it's by sort of gross teratology, a caterpillar ate it. Right? Sort of amputation, that sort of thing. Right, inside those 5 petals, outside the 5 petals, you've got 5 sepals, again, clearly 5. Inside, you get the stamens, the little fellows that carry the pollen. And they are many. I don't know how many there are, there are a hell of a lot of them. There are probably, what, 120? Between 100 and 200, I would guess. Little tiny stalks, each with a pollen blob on the end. Inside again, you get the female organs, which are again accurately 5. But stamens are many. Petals are 5. And many is a different sort of an angle from 5, a different sort of a language from 5. Birds, crows, I understand, are able to deal up to 7. And it's not clear whether they count or work by pattern. The experiments were designed to force the crows to count. And they're able to handle up to 7. The experiments are interesting Because how are you going to make a difference, you see, between counting and pattern recognition? What they did was to have a number of little cups with lids. In cups were little bits of meat. Some cups had one piece of meat, and some cups had 2 or more pieces of meat, and some cups had no pieces of meat. There's a row of 7 or 8 cups and meat in the cups. The crow has to go, take up the lid, and then eat whatever meat is in the cup. Go on to the next cup, take the lid, eat the meat. When he's done this, he is allowed to go to a plate on which there are more bits of meat than he found in the cups. And he's very heavily punished if he eats out of that plate more bits than he found in the cups. He's got to eat the same number off the plate, leaving then some uneaten, which is not, easy for a crow to do. And this, they can manage up to 4 bits of meat scattered in the cups and duplicate it by eating from the plate. It's an extraordinary achievement, really. I find it very difficult to make a child do it, even. But that's counting, or it's pattern. It might be some sort of a dance that the crow dances, which would work out as a way of recognizing a number. Yeah, red shirt.
Yesterday you talked about the interpretation not being the dream, and then you described the mind on layers. How do you know it's in layers? And how do you know dreams indicate an unconscious that's below? Why isn't the dream sufficiently the unconscious? I mean, how did you get the map, and what's the relationship between the map and the actual territory, which none of us can see?
Yeah, somebody here is enjoying your question. It's a very good question. Because the map in this case was, you see, not really mine. I was accepting and modifying somebody else's map. And you asked me how I got the parts that I got from somebody else, which is really Freud in the end, probably. I don't have an answer, of course. The whole thing has to be thrown in the melting pot, and should have been, and you're right, I think. I think the question is well taken, and that what I was doing was operating within a tradition and hadn't examined the tradition, but it had modified it to go on to, right? I think so. Yep. What's that hat? Oh, yeah, you've had enough. You're having fun. This lady here.
You've done some work in the isolation tank. I'm curious if you can describe how your mind works under those conditions.
Wet. Wait, I haven't done much in isolation tanks. John Lilly made everybody that went through his tanks make comments, and so I made some, and I did, in fact. I have twice been in his isolation tanks. The first was in rather a small tank, which he had at Esselad at one stage, and the second was in his newest big tank down at Malibu in his house. The small tank I found quite panic-making, quite uncomfortable. The temperature seemed to be wrong, and I felt dank, stinky, It's it's all a little bit chlorinated or something, disinfected, and I cannot say that I ever let go of anything. Second time in the big tank, I was much more comfortable and much more able to let go of anxieties, terrors, disgusts, all that. I don't know. I spent a great deal of time in the last 5 years, I guess, not sure, lying awake. I sleep about 4 hours a night, but I lie awake very relaxed, actually, quite a lot more. I'm not, you see, seriously sleep short. And lying awake, I think about the book I'm writing. I think about what I'm going to say in the next lecture. I think about my friends. I think about the garden. And when I was not worrying about the fact of the tank, it was very much like lying awake in bed. Quite peaceful, quite comfortable. Not, I didn't hallucinate any or anything of that kind. I don't hallucinate much. Once in a while I'll hear my name called, which I take it you all do, most of you. I wouldn't say I was in any state other than a relaxed state, a little drowsy, and the thoughts just running along. Can you, what, one more after this? That's the one I gave it to. About an hour each time.
In these discussion of this circuit on the board and the paradox of Epimenides, and I suppose also in the case of double binds, when you unfold this paradox or this circuit into a process, you get linear time. There's a linear sequential relationship, for instance, alternation.
As if you were rolling the wheel down the road, yes?
Right. Yes, right. No, yes, no, yes, no, or valve, fuel, and so on, around like that. In Spencer Brown's logic, there's also a disjunction operation, as well as the negation. That is, you could have a choice of two or even more alternatives. And I've been playing with this a little bit from a purely mathematical point of view.
From a what point of view?
Mathematical point of view. Leading to a notion of multiple binds, if you like. And what one seems to get out of this is a partially ordered time. As time is no longer linear sequential, but it breaks into alternate worlds as you go further along this unfolding process. And I wonder if you've thought about anything like this. Do you have any insights that might help me in constructing this mathematics so it meant something?
I know where I would go if I were you, which I thank God I'm not. Namely, I would go to Anatole Holt's work with Petri nets and concurrence, as he calls it. You'll find the beginning of the story in rather elementary form in the book which my daughter, Catherine Bateson, Mary Catherine Bateson, edited, called Our Own Metaphor. This was a report of a conference under the Wenner-Gren, at which we had Anatole Holt, who presented this material. I think you'll find that concurrence may well be a piece of vocabulary related to what you're talking about. But I mean, I'm talking off the top of my head. I only half understand what you said.
Yeah, actually, I think that's right. I know that work rather well. I'm a computer scientist. I've done some work in the mathematical theory of concurrence as well. And I think
that may be the place to make some theoretical starts. Well,
I was thinking in terms of psychotherapy rather than sort of further mathematical models of man-created processes or social things. Do you know of any examples in which this kind of thing might be happening in the social world rather than in this artificial man-created world?
There are funny things that happen with contextual structure. If you map dependency, you want to define it, you will say that A is dependent on B is to be represented by A1, B, A2, where these lowercase letters represent signals or behaviors by A and B, the persons, right? And this one is a signal of weakness. This one is the reply to that weakness, the helping of that weakness, and this one is the acceptance of that help, right? If now you want to define dominance between A and B, and the statement is A is dominant to B, you get this diagram, A1, B, A2. The same diagram. This now is a command. This now is an obedience to a command. And this is a reinforcement. A reward. Very simple learning context, yes? But the two things are the same. Now the thing is, do the two people, how do they see it? You could be A and say, I'm in charge, I'm dominant. Dominant. Or you could be B and say, I am succoring A. If you look at, what's that miserable butler, valet, young man, scapegrace young man, British. Huh?
Jeeves? She says Jeeves.
No, not. Yeah, Jeeves, and what's the young man's name?
Bertie Wooster.
Bertie Wooster, right. Here's Bertie, you see, dominant. And here's Jeeves rescuing him. And what you can do is to look at the same events and make different gestalt structures upon them. I don't know whether that would help you at all.
It's a thought.
By different ways of cutting the sequence of interchange, you see, you can have.
I guess what I'm interested in are things that you really would have great difficulty in making into sequences at all. That at some point there's a branching of views and just inexorably further branches.
In your mathematical structures?
Yeah.
A little glue you need. To make the sequences longer, yes. I think, any idea? All right. There's one there. You gave somebody a mic? All right, give him a mic.
Thank you. I've been trying to ask this question for a while. So I'm a psychologist, and we have a problem in psychology, which it seems that at least I feel I'm running into with your explanation. And the problem I run into is the same problem I run into with Piaget. I'm sure some people know his work here. He uses terms such as assimilation, accommodation, equilibration as kind of meta terms for the ongoing activity of the organism and the environment. And you have some meta terms as well. You have calibration, feedback, typologies, etc.
Yep.
Symmetrical relations, complementary. And the problem we have with Piaget in psychology is that we get into kind of an infinite regress when you deal with any specific kind of empirical data, which is that everything regresses to assimilation, accommodation, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And I feel like I have the same kind of problem with some of your dichotomies, symmetry and complementary, for example, or especially the calibration and feedback, which sounds a lot like assimilation and accommodation. And I wonder if, basically the question is, at what level do you feel that you're at in terms of describing the things that you're interested in? And really, it seems to me that you might be at the same level as Piaget, which is a very high level, but has problems, which is a typological level. You've laid out some labels, some typologies of some meta processes, and we haven't gotten into the processes that get beyond those labels.
The difficulty is, you see, that there's not only me in the picture dissecting this description, which I've gotten perhaps with a camera. There is also the people concerned who also dissect their sequences of behavior. And the difficulty arises in that I'm not in the end, you see, trying to make an objective description in the sense that I look at the film record of what they did and say, now he did that, and now he did that, and now he did that, and his little finger wiggled, and his toe went, whatever, right? This one could do. I think it'd be completely uninteresting, but you can do it. What I'm concerned with doing is writing that description from my position, which shall be somehow a reflection of the sort of way in which the people themselves dissected the sequence in which they were. The words dominant, dependent, etc., that we've been pushing around just to keep things simple, are in fact not merely my vocabulary, but are my attempt to construct a vocabulary which shall reflect their vocabulary. At this point, the logics of the system, you know, have to be flexible enough to deal not only with my muddle-headedness, which I will try and control, but with their muddle-headedness, which I cannot control.
Piaget has the same problem with little infants.
Piaget, of course, has the same problem. And when I meet Piaget, we both have that problem, yes, mutually, of course.
So you do believe that you're at a typological level?
And one does the best one can.
Yeah.
And it's only 1977, and maybe in 1980 we'll know a little more, or have a different model to dissect it onto. I guess that's it, isn't it? Sorry.
I'll ask.